Let me introduce Hamad Al-Rayes. Hamad Al-Rayes is a senior lecturer and the student counselor at the Bahrain Institute of Banking and Finance, BIBF, where he teaches critical thinking, business ethics, and academic writing and research skills, among other subjects. His approach to counseling is fundamentally based on the principles of philosophical practice as delineated by the APPA and Logic-Based Therapy, LBT. His interests range from the philosophy of poetry to the philosophy of education. Currently, his research is focused on discovering his own voice as a philosophical counselor, drawing on the recent history of philosophical practice, the wisdom traditions of the East and West, and existential psychology. The title of his talk today is Living on the God's Good Side, Eudaimonia as the Reintegration of the Daimonic. So without further ado, I would hand the floor over to Hamad, and let's see what he has to say. Hamad, you've got the mic.
Thank you, Rick. Yes, so this is just, as you mentioned, as just research that I've been doing to discover where I stand philosophically as a counselor. I was just recently certified in the January batch, like a few months ago. And, I've been reading a lot about philosophical practice before that. And of course, after doing the training, I started reading much more about it, especially Pierre Grimes, who is obviously a foundational figure. So all of this is to say, these comments are kind of a work in progress, just a way for me to try to make sense of my position as a philosopher and as a counselor. So I will be sharing the paper. Do you see it on your screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. I listen to a lot of audiobooks. I do a lot of research by listening to audiobooks, and I find that I comprehend and absorb much more if I'm reading the text and listening to it at the same time. So I'm sharing it just for your convenience. There is things in curly brackets. Those are just my own my citations, which I usually plug in at the very end before I submit it anywhere. I kept it here so I have a reference of the works that I'm citing as I'm speaking. Okay, so I will begin. I will begin with the definition of the pathologos as Grimes puts it in Philosophical Midwifery, his book. He defines it as the lack of awareness that one's judgments about oneself and the nature of reality are derived from particular experiences in one's past, generalized to all, and being unable to relate to or accept that there is sufficient evidence to deny the generality of these judgments, yet thinking, feeling, and acting upon them as if they were self-evident, general truths. These irrational beliefs, he calls them irrational beliefs in the prior sentence, where you see the ellipses, these irrational beliefs are always irreconcilable with the attainment of one's personally meaningful goals. So let's begin. One aspect of the pathologos, from how I understand it, is that it's always very particular to the individual themselves. So the question that I begin with is, what is it that makes each one of us born with their own unique pathologos? Okay. For Pierre Grimes, the reason revolves in the double helix of Aristotelian first and second nature, of our brute birth as biological organisms, and second, refined birth as cultural beings. It is something in the intimacy of the family nest, and something equally rooted in the entry of the animal into the sphere of social life. This amounts to an acknowledgement of a twin birth of the individual, which, in this case, is more of the birth of a twin alongside the individual. This twin bears the excesses of the psychic monad, Cornelius Castoriadis' term for the polymorphously perverse psychic unit that overflows the somatic organism from the very first years of life, before initiation into the social imaginary or into instituted society. Entry into society, therefore, becomes something conditional upon the sacrifice of the primal self. The psychic monad is dismembered at the altar of the reality principle. Grimes would add that this psychic monad bears in itself something irreducible, something unique that only comes into existence with the physical birth of the human organism. The pathologos, quickening our social birth, works as psychic parasite as well. As Grimes notes, the question of the pathologos is always a question of the individual against the machinery of family, culture, and state. But the individual is not only the ID-carrying citizen, the pale, abstract, shadowless body. Rather, it is the full-blooded individual, the shadowed body, that is the locus of my volition and desire. On the one hand, here is born the pragmatic self, which surfaces in polite society, with all the connotation of pragmata as mere doings and expendable things. On the other, here is also born the chthonic impulses erupting from the body, together with their spectral reflections on the outermost reaches of the mind, the flesh and phantasmagoria of inner life. To the latter conflagration of the visceral and the mental, I will give the name of the daimonic, in clear allusion to the inner voice that guided Socrates in questioning the values of the Athenians and challenging the false beliefs that ran rampant therein. So let us talk a little bit about the connection between Socratic questioning and the pathologos, and how they relate to what I want to say about the daimonic. Before settling on a definition of justice in the Republic, one finds in that dialogue something of an immediate resistance to what justice is not. So before defining justice, there's a lot of, it seems to me, assumptions about what justice cannot be. Above all, it is perceived that justice cannot be a state of disharmony. I presume that this is the case because, in a sense, justice is taken as an ontological prerequisite in the strict sense, as if to say, that which truly is only insofar as it is an integral unity. On this reading, striving toward justice would amount to striving toward true being. One is, the more one is internally integrated. Conversely, one fades, or one's oneness fades, the more disintegration threatens one's concrete unity. This would go for the individual as well as for the state. But what does this mean? For philosophical practice, I take it to mean that the Socratic questioner is always enlisted to draw on and even join forces with beliefs and impulses that lie beyond the reaches of their familiar self-image. This is why Grimes places so much weight on the interpretation of dreams and daydreams, for example. Dreams and daydreams are sites where the daimonic, or better yet, one's own daimonic, can be surfaced. That is, with the right practice of dialectic. Dreams and daydreams are valuable for philosophical practice because they tell us something about our innermost beliefs and desires. According to Grimes, the aim of the dialectic in philosophical midwifery is the arrival at the integral vision of the unity of the sensible and the intelligible. In other words, at the idea of the good. The dialectic thus draws its value from its ability to reveal the degree to which our innermost beliefs and desires reflect the idea of the good. If the counselor sets herself the task of modeling the Socratic ethos and encouraging the same in the client, this would mean drawing on the same daimonia that animated Socrates' unapologetic questioning of the dearest assumptions of Athenian life. So in Apology, Socrates is accused of bringing in new daimonia, new demonic doings into their culture. Introducing new gods is usually how it's translated. The daimonic is just that power which urges us to question and thus negate the shibboleths of received wisdom. It is the tremendous power of the negative which Hegel spoke of in his memorable description of human subjectivity. There's an adversarial kernel in the individual, perhaps the lingering murmur of the psychic monad I just talked about, that will not submit to the frozen totality of the universal. According to Hegel, Socrates' heroism was to channel that surplus into the realm of ideas as a negating counterforce, questioning the ways of the Athenians. The transgressive impulse that seeks to examine and know for itself, Hegel called the principle of subjective reflection. This principle functions as a site of conflicted freedom. In it, the destructive and constructive, sedition and salvation are intertwined. It is a threat as much as a promise to both the individual and their community. This leads us to Hegel's comments on Socrates as a heroic figure, which is deeply tied to the idea of the daimonic as the animating force of Socratic questioning. So in general history, writes Hegel, we find that this is the position of the heroes through whom a new world commences, and whose principle stands in contradiction to what has gone before and disintegrates it. They appear to be violently destroying the laws. Grimes, for his part, fully acknowledged that one takes the greatest risk in attempting to know and justify for oneself the system of beliefs that shapes one's existence, as bondage to the pathologos carries with it its own array of advantages and comforts. Grimes says the pathologos has its own highs, like, when you're high on drugs. Like the warmth of familiar reality, a sense of control, a sanctioned identity, belonging to a tribe, among other things. But the negative, when I talk about the negative, I am talking about the idea of Socratic questioning, or this principle of subjective reflection in Hegel's words. But the negative is not aimless iconoclasm. The hero, let us note in passing, is classically portrayed as a mortal harboring something of the divine within, the offspring of gods, immortal creators. The negative, as the principle of destruction and transformation, is pregnant with a positive or reconciliatory aspiration as well. Questioning is never engaged in for its own sake. It is provoked by a sense of puzzlement, called upon to solve a problem, incited to address a contradiction. At the very least, we question to linger a little longer with delicious wondering. But what is it that ultimately guides the subject in her inquiry? Does questioning, especially of the Socratic sort, aim at some definite purpose that can be named? At the junctures where we would expect Grimes to be talking about the positive aims toward which philosophical midwifery is directed, we often find him invoking one's noblest goals, our loftiest goals, our noblest goals, sometimes self-actualization, or plainly philosophical goals. What are these noblest goals, over and above the negative definition of a self without the domination of the pathologos? Grimes is clearest when he describes the philosophical quest as seeking that loftiest vision, a vision of the good itself. The positive, substantial outcome that animates the daimonic in the course of dialectical examination is ultimately nothing but the good, or rather, as Grimes always insists, the idea of the good, which he separates from the good itself, and that's a whole other discussion. Conversely, the pathologos surfaces in and through the encounter with excellence and in pursuit of one's highest ideals. So, in other words, the idea of the good smokes out the pathologos as it fans the flame of the dialectic. It's revealing both of the pathologos and the good toward which we orient our lives. Taking his cue from Proclus, Grimes argues that it is the desire of the subject that ultimately orients the dialectic toward the good, thus helping the subject lead a flourishing eudaimonistic life. It is precisely here, at the nexus of negativity, desire, and the good, that we can gain deeper insight into the role of the daimonic in philosophical counseling. Okay. I will get into a little detail about how desire and reason are discussed in the Republic, especially, and a little bit about Aristotle's view. But I think these exegetical remarks are important for what I will have to say in this paper. So bear with me. I mean, I think it's interesting. Let me just get into it. What can desire tell me about the good? Isn't the good an object for the contemplative or the purely rational potency in man? In Book Lambda, Metaphysics, Aristotle sums up the relationship between desire, reason, and the good as follows. He says, but what is primary for desire and for intelligibility is the same. Sometimes this is translated as the object of desire and reason, or the intellect is the same. For what is desired is what appears good, and the primary object of rational will is what is good. The good, then, is the object of desire and of reason, of the appetitive as well as the rational parts of the soul. How one interprets this passage, really how one values the part played by desire in attaining the good life, Eudaimonia, depends on how one views the relationship of desire to reason. The passage can be interpreted in two ways, turning on a deep-seated ambivalence at the heart of the concept of reason itself. Is reason simply a calculating faculty presiding over the lower irrational faculties, or is it something more comprehensive, shining over the higher as well as the lower parts of the soul? Turning it around, we may ask, is desire simply a property of the instinctive, appetitive soul, or does it extend over and inform the different parts of the soul taken together? In Book 4 of the Republic, this is a classical place where this problem is first discussed, both senses of reason and desire are presented. On one hand, if we start by looking at how the scope and jurisdiction of reason is laid out, Socrates seems to be arguing that reason is to rule over the appetitive part of the soul, dictating to it from without what it should and should not pursue. This is not a misreading. There is no shortage, of course, in the Republic of depictions of the lower classes, they're emblematic of the appetitive part of the soul, as wild or disorderly, unmanageable, and ultimately in need of the rational ruling class to set them straight. On the other hand, if we set off from the virtue of the appetitive part, so if we set out from the bottom, so to speak, instead of the top, so if we set out from the virtue of the appetitive part, often understood as the final word on desire, so I mean, and actually in Republic at least, the word that is used for the appetites is the same as the word that's used for desire. So only until Aristotle that these two concepts are really distinguished from each other. And this is also important. I'll mention something about it later on. Anyway, on the other hand, if we set off from the virtue of the appetitive part, often understood as the final word on desire, we might be in for a different story. Socrates makes a comment that moderation, typically the cardinal virtue of the appetitive part of the soul, is to rule over the other parts of the soul, including the rational part. In other words, it could be that what is appropriate to desire extends to the entire soul, in which case the vector of desire would preside over the entirety of the soul, just like the vector of wisdom. You see the problem clearly if you see it now as coextensive with the problem of the right form of government, of just rule. How? A question of just rule, as students of the Republic know, oscillates between the poles of cohesion and flourishing, status and transformation, self-preservation and self-development. Likewise, the question hinges on these two contraries in the human psyche. Cohesion, unity, stability, a substantial degree of homeostasis is a sine qua non for any further growth, whether in the state or the soul. On the other hand, the drive toward cohesion is the grand device of tyranny, which threatens to bring about the exact opposite of cohesion, namely collapse and disintegration, as Plato argues in the Republic with regard to the cyclical forms of government. Likewise, on the side of flourishing, the ideal of growth and development, which threatens anarchy if pursued without care for the integral unity of the self. Sorry, there's a typo here, but the side of flourishing threatens anarchy if pursued without care for the integral unity of the self or the state. For both, the watchword is justice. Or is it moderation? Julia Annas has already pointed out the supreme difficulty for interpreters of Plato as well as for Plato's contemporaries in fixing this virtue, sophrosune, to a single meaning. The usual English translation is moderation or temperance. It can also be translated as minding one's own, knowing one's proper station, knowing what one owes to oneself and others, all of which overlap considerably with the Republic's definition of justice. Grimes is interesting. He chooses to refer to sophrosune, this moderation, as clear-headedness. So I assume he senses the different meanings, the overlaps it has with the different senses of justice. In all cases, there is something that distinguishes this virtue from the others, namely that it is not exclusive to a single class of the ideal state, nor to a single part of the soul. It is possible on these grounds to infer a desiring function in the cognitive as well as the conative or instinctive dimensions of the soul. On this reading, reason itself could be said to want and will, that is, to desire. And we will have to talk of a virtue of desire that does not exactly coincide with the virtue of the appetites, though they both share the same name, moderation, given that the rational part of the soul is also animated by its own aims and desires. This is something that Socrates talks about at the end of Book 5. In other words, desire itself can now be viewed in two ways. The first would treat it simply as the antipode of reason, coterminous with the irrational part of the soul, which should submit to the dictates of reason, now itself seen as something cold and desireless, a capacity for disinterested calculation. The second reading, on the contrary, complicates the relationship between the two, presenting desire itself as an expression of the entire soul, with a logos and potentially a wisdom entirely its own. As one scholar recently put it, far from representing the lowest compartment of the soul, desire on this reading would stand for, quote, an expression of the entire soul, built upon its natural capabilities. And the soul manifests itself not as a logon, so without logos or irrational, but with a logos that is intrinsic to the manifest desire, be it submitting the epithumethikon, which is the appetitive or desiring part of the soul. Again, Plato uses the same word for both, which to me indicates the conflict that I'm trying to tease out here, the conception of desire. Is it something that just belongs to our so-called animal natures, or is it actually characteristic of human subjectivity itself? Be it submitting a desire to the logistikon, which is the rational or calculating part of the soul, or the other way around. Okay, it is true that Aristotle shed much philosophical light and brought much logical rigor to the denominations of desire. In De Anima, he picks apart the view of the soul as a composite of insulated parts. So the Platonic, the idea that's attributed to Plato, the soul having just three separate parts, on third-man grounds, encapsulated in the question, what is it that holds the soul together if its nature is to be a thing of parts? He's saying, well, if the soul has three parts, then there has to be something holding it together. And if there is something holding it together, then that is probably what we're talking about when we talk about the soul. But the problem will just keep repeating itself if we say that the soul is composite, because we'll just have infinite regress. It is true also that he goes a long way, Aristotle goes a long way in resolving some of the complications surrounding Platonic desire by restricting epithemia, which in the Republic vacillates between the two meanings, referencing both specifically appetitive desire and desire broadly speaking, when he resolves it narrowly into appetitive desire, which, while regulating desire broadly speaking to generic orexis, of which epithemia is now a species. Meaning Aristotle's solution basically is to say, actually, no, there is desire, broadly speaking, and then we can talk about the desire of the animal part or the vegetative part of the soul, and then we have desire of the thumetic part, so the courageous or the emotional part, if you will, the spirited part of the soul, and then we also have orexis or desire for the rational part of the soul. So this is Aristotle's solution. All of this is necessary work, of course, on more than one register, ontologically, epistemologically, and in terms of moral psychology. But, so why am I talking about the Republic then? But if the Republic is the spiritual manual that Grimes claims it is, we would be ill-advised to drop it so quickly. For the care of the soul, which is the primary concern of philosophical counseling, it is still worth thinking of desire in the Platonic terms of justice in the soul, that is, as something related to potential conflicts between different types of desires inherent in different parts of the soul, in whatever way we may wish to understand this part-whole relationship. I may understand philosophically, following Aristotle, that the soul is one, but until that becomes my lived reality, embodied in my every wish and action. I must still save the appearance of my fragmented self, with its clamoring voices, if only because, as a matter of fact, my existence is somehow spread over the two levels. These exegetical comments bear on the aims of philosophical practice in one more way. It is no secret that ascetic ideals of all stripes feed off the conception of desire as a logon. Such a conviction lurks at the bottom of every wisdom tradition that declares happiness as the result of a battle against desire. I will just quote Maslow here and move on, just for time. Just for the time. As Maslow puts it, all such traditions endorse a deficiency model of desire, the burdensome view of desire exclusively as the response to a lack that should be fulfilled. And toward a psychology of being, he writes, this derogation of desire and need has, of course, been a constant theme throughout the history of philosophy, theology, and psychology. The Stoics, most hedonists, practically all theologians, many political philosophers, and most economic theorists, and I think he means theorists who accept an idea of rational choice, the individual as an agent of rational choice, have united in affirming the fact that good or happiness or pleasure is essentially the consequence of amelioration of this unpleasant state of affairs of wanting or of desiring or of needing. To put it as succinctly as possible, these people all find desire or impulse to be a nuisance or even a threat, and therefore will try generally to get rid of it, to deny it, or to avoid it. And I think I have benefited personally and still do benefit from a lot of Stoic wisdom about how to maintain equanimity towards your emotions and towards things, externalities, as they call them, things that happen to you outside of your own control. But I don't think that it is healthy to set that by itself as the goal of your life. And of course, I this is something I keep thinking about. I've gone back and forth on this issue for a very long time. But let me pass by this part because that's what I had to say about the idea of the importance of desire for counseling and for orienting the soul towards the good. I will just mention this last paragraph before getting into what Grimes has to say about the daimonic. If reason was confined to mere deliberation and calculation based on the signals it received from the appetites, that is, if each part of the soul was viewed as a self-enclosed compartment, siloed off from the rest, reason itself would have no motivation to perform its own dreary duty. This goes back to a critique that Bernard Williams made against Republic, a view of the soul in the Republic. Better to speak of desiring itself as an expression of reason and of reasoning as a flowering of desire. After all, desire and reason are both about the same thing, the good. But we are rarely satisfied with the image of the good that has been handed down to us from our social milieu. Such dissatisfaction, or, as is often the case, the suffering which is its symptom, is one of the primary indicators of the pathologos, and one of the primary reasons for seeking the counsel of philosophy. So what is the origin of our unease? Here, we can take 4 minutes exactly to see Pierre Grimes' comment on the apology. Just, I will play it and tell me if you can hear it.
He said, I've been commanded military posts, and that's where I have placed myself.
Can you hear it?
Here's where it starts now. But when the God gave me a station, as I believed and understood, with orders to spend my life in philosophy and examining myself and others, there, right, that's his post. With orders to spend my life in philosophy and examining myself and others. He said, if I were to desert my post through fear of death or anything else, he said, I would be disobeying the God. He said, don't worry about death. There's nothing to fear about death. So he thinks he has been assigned this post by God. For know that the God commands me to do this, and I believe that no greater good ever came to pass in the city than my service to the God. He said, I just go around and tell you to take care of your souls. That's my job. He said, no better thing has happened in Athens. Now, I'm going to say some things to you at which you might, perhaps cry out. But do not do so by any means, for I know if you kill me, I being such a man as I am, you will not injure me as much as yourselves. For neither Miletus nor Anytus could injure me. That would be impossible, for I believe it is not God's will that a better man should be injured by a worse. And so, men of Athens, I am now making my defense not for my own sake, as one might imagine, but far more for yours, that you may not, by condemning me, err in your treatment of the gift God gave you. Sees himself as a gift of God. He says, if you put me to death, he says, you won't easily find another. So I'll tell you what I am. I'm a gadfly. I think that God fastened me upon the city in some such capacity, and I go about arousing and urging and reproaching each one of you, constantly alighting upon you everywhere the whole day long. Oh yes, he says, perhaps you might be angry like people awakened from a nap, and might slap me, as Anytus advises, and easily kill me. Then you'd pass the rest of your lives in a slumber, unless God, in his care for you, should send someone else to sting you. And that I am, as I say, a kind of gift from the gods, you might understand from this.
Okay, the point that Grimes tries to make in this whole lecture, which I highly recommend, you can find all of them. They're on YouTube and they're also on the archive.org. This one is the one on apology from 1997, is basically to say that it's Socrates' daimon, what's known as Socrates' daimon, is the thing that actually spurs him on to make all these questions. Essentially, the point I was trying to make, and actually that's what inspired the entire paper. So I had to include the actual reference from Grimes. But I know that we are running a little on time, but I will just mention the last thing that ties it all together. What's the relationship of the daimonic to philosophical practice as I see it? And I'll try to make this quick. So, no psychologist has devoted more of his life's work toward disclosing the role of the daimonic in therapy than Rollo May. Rather than go over May's rich exposition of the role and function of the daimonic in psychotherapy, I will limit myself to picking out certain aspects of his analysis, starting with the definition. He defines the daimonic in two passages. First of all, he says, the daimonic is any natural function which has the power to take over the whole person. Sex and eros, anger and rage, and the craving for power are examples. Daimonic can be either creative or destructive, and so on. Then he adds that the daimonic is the urge in which every being to affirm itself or assert itself, or to perpetuate and increase itself. I think all of this can be seen as being expressed in the way in which Socrates questions the Athenians and tries to challenge their traditions and values. In fact, May, right after defining the daimonic, immediately goes into talking about Socrates' demon, pretty much in the sense that I have been talking about it, specifically as showing itself in the kind of dialectical questioning that Socrates practiced. However, I do take issue with May on one point. Actually, 2 points. First of all, he says that the daimonic is the sign of nature, but I think we should not forget that nature is not one in human life. We inhabit both Aristotelian first and second nature. Accordingly, I would argue that the daimonic channels the highest aspirations together with the most threatening urges of both the things beneath the earth and the things in the air, in reference to the daimonia or demonic things that Socrates was accused of releasing into Athenian society. So I think that the daimonic needs to be understood as something that channels both the realms of worms, so to speak, and the realm of the spirit, between which the drama of each human life unfolds. At the end of the day, this means that the life of desire, with all its vicissitudes, from the cold and calculating to the purely appetitive, or from desire for wisdom to the craving for carnal pleasure, partakes of the daimonic. So much for the significance for philosophical counseling of such a broad view of the daimonic, spreading its wings over the transcendent and the abject alike. We must now inquire as to the kind of relationship one should seek with this volatile and unpredictable force. The relationship with the daimonic has to be seen as fraught with danger. However, the legitimate concern of protecting oneself against the destructive aspects of the daimonic cannot overshadow the importance of connecting with it on its own terms. This is because unless one confronts the daimonic as it is, one would risk taking the semblance for the real thing, to invoke a well-known Platonic trope, and thus forego the potential growth promised, I think, by establishing genuine contact with it. I would therefore hasten to point out that May misses the mark when he claims that eudaimonia is tantamount to taming the demon. He interprets eudaimonia as living in harmony with one's daimon. But what kind of harmony is this? We are led back to the question with which we started, namely that of the harmony of disparate desires in the self, the sign of which is justice in the soul. May seems to suggest that not only is it possible to tame the daimon, presumably aligning it with the idea of the good, but that it is beneficial to reconfigure that power of nature which is fundamentally beyond good and evil. I object to both views. Rather than reining in the daimonic, I think a better conception of eudaimonia is to hold the daimonic close but at arm's length, without seeking to interfere with its amoral tendencies. This, I claim, would constitute the best use of summoning the daimonic for the sake of the flourishing of the self, or eudaimonia. So essentially, I have a lot more written, but I will not go even more over time. But essentially, the point is here. I think that it's very beneficial, at least for myself, but also for people that I talk to try to surface these urges or aspirations. I really think that these daimonia that Socrates was accused of ruining Greek society through belong both to like our noblest goals that Grimes speaks of, but also they can come with some really abominable desires, which people just tend to have. The idea is to subject all of this before judging it to dialectical examination. I will stop here. I'm sorry I stopped abruptly, but I'm just trying to be wary of the time.
Great, Hamad. Will you end the screen share? Okay, great. So excellent, really fascinating presentation. I'll take advantage of the fact that I'm the moderator to go first and just say that. And I'm really curious to read the rest of the paper that you didn't share with us. So where is this being submitted for publication?
Well, I honestly wrote it for the APPA journal, but now I am wondering if I shot myself in the foot because I presented it already. I don't know if I can submit it or not?
Yes, you can. I can speak, I think, with an understanding of, I have a model of Lou Marinoff in my head. If I get that model wrong, Lou's right here and he could correct me, but I think he would invite you to submit it by absolutely.
Fantastic. I wrote it
Is
for
that correct? Did I get you correctly, Lou?
Absolutely, Rick. Your model's viable so far. Hamad, thank you. Yes, the rule is very simple. If it's not published elsewhere or has not been submitted for consideration of publication elsewhere, then certainly we welcome the submission. I just want to say that we have, fortunately for the journal, quite a queue of papers, in the pipeline. So it may not appear until next year, but that's a normal thing anyway for journals. I mean, philosophy journals don't tend to publish on the fly. But I think it's really interesting that, again, I echo Rick. The parts that you've shared with us are fascinating, and I too would like to read the whole thing. Okay, so please do submit it to us, and we'll be delighted to have it refereed. Okay.
Thank you. All right.
You're welcome.
Yes. So let's turn it over to our participants with any questions or comments for Hamad. Let me, maybe when we're looking to see if any hands are up, we'll put the gallery view back so we don't. Oh, Patrizia, wonderful. Let's start with you. You're still muted. There you go.
Okay. Can you hear? Okay.
Yeah.
So thanks a lot, Hamad. Really, really a fascinating, interesting, well-structured, rich presentation. And particularly, I appreciate the tribute to the thought of Pierre Grimes, of course, because it's interesting how tracing back to Socratic and Platonic tradition to the contemporary, he keeps together the two elements of our human nature: the daemon, the eudaimon, and the daemon, the good and the will. And I particularly appreciated the quotation for Grimes of the value of the interpretation of dreams, which we may find also, for example, in all the psychoanalytic tradition, Freud, and also in a contemporary psychiatrist and philosophy who is Irving Yalom, for example. Mm-hmm. The value of the dreams as an experience where we can keep together our bad and the good in a sort of metaphorical and sublimated way, which is in a way an experience similar to humor, which is a theme I'm working now with, and appreciating all the work by Lydia in these years. And then, so to experience that we can live our bad nature in a controlled and creative way without transforming into a negative. And another field, and then I stop because I want to be very short. Another area of exploration, in my opinion, is all the Christian tradition from the ancient Holy Bible, with the presence of the demon in bad angels like Lucifer, who is a god. Or in some Gospels, in Mark, for example, where the good and the bad are kept together and managed. And they're not to be denied, but they had to be recognized in order to manage them. And they can be source of a creative transformation. For example, in Mark, the devil is the Roman power and oppression, and the fact that it's recognized and accepted becomes a way to transform, in a way to become better. And so it's very interesting, especially for the value of dreams, which is something that belongs to our experience, where we can experience our daemon, our bad daemon, not our good daemon, eudaimon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Patricia. Yes, I think I should say more about the dream and the paper. I just kind of mention it in passing, but really, because Grimes has said so much about it, like there is, he's just. So I wanted to add something which I didn't get to mention here now, which is it's also though important to engage with our conscious desire as well as much as the dream. If only because sometimes we think that finding the dream as that site which we can keep together our good and bad, like in this controlled environment, so to speak, can lead to a sort of hesitancy to trying to actually embody these desires in our lives. It's always a risky project. It's always a risky thing to try to attempt. But I just think it's worth also to just highlight how our conscious desires, that I call like our secret desires, the things that we have in our heads, not just things that will erupt in our dreams, are also sites of like messages from this daimonic realm, which can all just be elicited by, like Yalom says, you just ask, what do you want? You always emphasize this question with a counselor or a client. What do you want? This want is really what brings out, what I'm talking about here as like more conscious desires instead of dreams.
Yes. What you want, your will of good in this case. Yes.
Ultimately, yes.
Yes. Thank you, Hamad.
Thank you.
Anyone else have a hand? Lou, please.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. We can run a little over. I mean, we have an hour for lunch, so we could go till noon if people want to continue. And I do. Hamad, even what you showed is very, very interesting. But you're opening a portal, and this segues from Patricia's comment also. And you're opening a portal into a fundamental component of human nature that ultimately it's a Gordian knot that no one has really been able to sever. This fundamental paradox of conflict. I mean, I personally believe, and through a lot of research have concluded, that all outer conflicts that we see in interpersonal relationships, in social and beyond that in political, outer conflicts are, I hypothesize, all manifestations of this inner conflict which is unresolved. And if the inner conflict of a person can be resolved, then it will be difficult to impossible to embroil them in outer conflicts. They will simply be immune from that sort of problem. But the inner conflict is the tricky one. And when I'm quoting your earlier words in the opening part of the paper, when you spoke of the sacrifice of the primal self, this is where it gets very interesting, is it not? Because this is reminiscent, on the one hand, of Hobbes's notion, which we see fundamentally in Leviathan, about having to impose on ourselves and accept liberty-limiting principles in order to get along with each other, right? So that's a political manifestation. And then, unbeknownst to Freud, he later reconstituted this psychologically in Civilization and Its Discontents, where we have to give up our instinctual desires for gratification in order to be accepted by society, and accept that acceptance as a kind of a compensation for giving up, once again, what the primal self presumably wants. So this is all grist for your mill, because we're saying that there is something, or Grimes is saying there's something in the primal self which is very noble and actually worthy, but which society will misinterpret perhaps as a desire to gratify something more instinctive and therefore crush. And we really need to be able to make that distinction within ourselves in order to indeed accept the liberty-limiting principles that are not salutary in decent society or civil society, but not to deny the things that are most noble, right, and have the courage to do what each of us perceives as our own internal goals, if they're indeed what are true to ourselves and therefore daimonic. So this is where you're opening a door onto this conversation in a really interesting way. And have you touched upon these things? This my first question, though, is your paper going into this in more depth?
A little bit, and I think pushing back against the idea, actually, which I think Grimes does believe, is that there is something, almost maybe a Rousseauian view, that there is something inherently kind of not worthwhile, that there's something inherently noble in our, the pre-social primal self, as I said here, these words. because I don't, and Rollo May goes the other way and says that, well, no, actually, the daimonic has to be tamed, which to me signals that there's something kind of inherently evil. I really think that the daimonic is, so to speak, beyond good and evil. It will give you something worth tackling, something worth engaging with, that should never be accepted or rejected like on face value. So I describe it at the end after engaging with this point, that this is actually the material for the dialectic that has to unfold in the course of counseling. It is these kinds of messages and signs from the daimonic, whether they're transcendent or like abject in both cases, because I think it channels the highest aspirations of the social milieu in which we are born, but also it channels the most base, asocial, maybe evil, maybe aggressive, and so on, impulses that a lot of us also harbor on some level.
So are you developing, just a quick question, are you developing this theme as a kind of a background for your own approach to philosophical
Yes.
counseling? This is your own like personal professional development, more or less?
Yes, I'm trying to, so that I know what I'm asking clients to, like, where are we going with me asking them, what the question, what do you want? Why am I talking to them about what are your ambitions? The same words, what are your like highest goals? What's the point of focusing on these things?
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Kevin has a hand up, so let's move over to Kevin. Please begin,
Hello,
Kevin.
all. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was very theoretically rich, and that led me to think about some of the issues I'm familiar with Plato and Aristotle. And I don't know whether or not you talk about these in your paper as opposed to not getting to them. You skipped over quite a bit, or the relevance necessarily as you're thinking about your own approach in philosophical counseling. But there were three things that kind of came to my mind. The first was with reading Pierre Grimes. Grimes is definitely someone I would refer to as a Neoplatonist, if you want to distinguish it from Plato and maybe a stricter version of Plato himself, in particular how Grimes focuses on the epikenos tesousias, the good beyond being, right? And he loves Proclus more than Plotinus, although I have to say I'm not that familiar with Proclus compared to Plotinus myself, but it's still there. I wonder if you have something to say about that. But then there's also, you were talking about Aristotle's criticism of Plato's complex soul, and the Republic has parts to it, right? Whereas this is problematic because you need something simple. And you talked about dealing with the appearance. And I'm wondering, do you think that having a complex concept of the soul is better able to explain something like weakness of will and other issues in psychology of action? Because it seemed like you want to talk about each part having its own desires, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's easier to talk about conflicting desires within a person if you have a complex conception of soul, right? Mm-hmm. At least that's an open question. I'll leave that to you. And then the last thing was you talked about first and second nature in Aristotle. Second nature being the habituation and character development that becomes virtue, right? And I was just wondering, do you, maybe I missed it, but do you see that in Plato already kind of present in the Republic, as there is a second nature that develops from the, you criticize the view, but reason taming the appetite?
Yes. Yes, thank you. I actually, the things I said about the Republic, they were just the product of this reading group I've been having here over the past, every month we read a book, and we got into these questions of like, what The rational part wants to tame, the appetitive part, for example, on one reading. But does this mean that the rational part has like any desire of its own? If it does have any desire, then it has a part of the appetitive part in itself. There's like an ambiguity inside the text, I believe. Like that's just how at least up to this point, how I read the Republic. It allows us to make both statements. We can say that each part has its own function, and so if the appetitive part desires and the others don't desire, and the rational part has to subjugate the appetitive part based on its calculations, like its foresight, or we can say that no, desire belongs to the whole soul, or to each part of the soul has its own kind of desire, which was ultimately Aristotle's view. But I don't. Sorry, I think I missed your question now as I'm talking. Your last question.
The last one was, do you see the a first and second nature already in Plato and the Republic?
Yes. Okay. I don't know, honestly, because as much as I have, talked about Plato and Aristotle here, I am relying on the work of experts because it's not my specialty, actually. I am just reading a lot of Plato and Aristotle because of Pierre Grimes, honestly. But as far as I can know, as far as I can tell, there is something of like the ennobling character of like the good state that does elevate us above our brute appetitive instincts. So maybe there is something of that in Plato, but to be very honest, I am not qualified to answer that question. But I do want to say something about the point you brought up with regard to Grimes's Neoplatonism, of his the good that is basically beyond being. I think he talks about it at one place. A last part of the paper has to do with the ascetic ideal, because Grimes does make certain statements that seem to me to say, well, I mean, he says so in so many words that there's something to trying to separate the soul from the body, and to be able to contemplate the good in itself, which is beyond the idea of the good. And I personally, but also just, well, yeah, I think for now I will just say personally, I have much resistance against this kind of ascetic. I see it as harboring something of the an ascetic ideal in there, that if as useful as it may be, like the same stuff I said with the Stoics, that there is definitely something to say, separate what you can control, separate what you can understand from everything outside of. There's definitely something to be said there. But what I find myself to be against is to make that the ultimate goal of life, that kind of apatheia, which I believe the idea of beholding the good beyond the idea of the good amounts to.
All right, we are coming upon the end of our time, so I want to. Kevin asked like 3 really complex questions, so you could.
They are very complex, but I wrote them down so I can work on them on the paper.
Yeah, but once again, I'm going to take advantage of my role as moderator and just throw in one thought. Well, your reasoning about the important connection between desire and daimonic nature as integrated is something that goes against that asceticism altogether. That came pretty clearly through it. And the implications for Buddhism are not very comfortable, in my opinion, because one of the key concepts in Buddhism is to eliminate the flame, the craving, the desire, yes, grasping at existence. And that's connected with selfhood. So they seem to be onto something, but in a negative version of what you're making a positive account of, right? The way their formula for eliminating the pathos of life is to eliminate desire and selfhood altogether. But but that might be the complete opposite of what the Platonic. There's a book, I haven't read it, but a friend of mine keeps talking about it. I want to mention it to you, called Hellenic Tantra, which I think embraces this idea.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yes, all about the embrace of the daemon and desire and all that. And I would love if we had more time to hear how you tie together. I'm not sure. I'm never sure how to pronounce sophrosin or whatever that Greek word is.
The moderation.
Yeah, moderation is one interpretation, but I like the other interpretation that you seem to be moving towards. So I'm really looking forward to you saying more about that in that paper.
Thank you. Yes. I mean, I just to comment on that, I don't want to be so dismissive of these traditions, because they are like genuine. I mean, it sounds silly to even compliment them, because these are like age-old wisdom traditions that the whole of humanity has learned from over like thousands of years. And there is great strength that comes from the ability to separate your soul from your material existence. There is a lot of clarity and insight that can come through that. But there is something, yes, like you say, that I am also uncomfortable with. And I think this will just be a question that I struggle with for maybe the rest of my life.
Lou, I think you had a hand up. Did you want to close this out, Lou?
Oh, sure. Just to thank Hamad again and you, Rick, for moderating the session, and just to remind everyone that we're going to pause for lunch or whatever meal you may wish to consume at this point. But we will return this has been a fantastic start. Thank you so much, Hamad. Really interesting. And like Rick and the others, I look forward to reading the full-blown work.
Thank you.
And we will resume at 1 o'clock, 56 minutes from now. So it's almost an hour. Okay. Please come back at 1 o'clock New York time, and we will continue our wonderful program today. Thanks again.
And when we come back, Hamad, if you would be so kind as to put your email in the chat.
Yes.
There's a lot of interest here. I think people might want to email you questions.
I will. Yes. Thank you. Thank you all. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you too. See you at 1 p.m.
Thank you. Ciao.